I want to welcome all of you tonight to tonight's Rosenmeier Forum, in which we honor the memory and legacy of Gordon Rosenmeier, the state senator from Little Falls, who represented Morrison and Crow Wing counties in the state senate from 1940 to 1970. Rosenmeier, who became a legend in Minnesota government, was a principled conservative. He was a principled conservative who Minnesota historians have stated was the most powerful, the most knowledgeable, and the most respected legislator in all of Minnesota history. I am also pleased tonight to introduce to you our Rosenmeier Forum speaker, the Honorable Gil Gutknecht, a former member of Congress from Rochester, Minnesota, who represented the 1st District in Congress from 1994 to 2006. In Congress, Mr. Gutknecht served on the House Agriculture Committee, which is key for Minnesota's #1 industry, which is agriculture. And he also served on the House Budget Committee. And during his service on that committee, they were able to balance the federal budget from 1995 to 1999, which was an historic first. It was the first time that that had happened in the Congress in 100 years. Mr. Gutknecht also is a journalist and a writer for Town Hall, writing on the national issues of today facing our nation. I got to know Congressman Gutknecht when he was first elected to the Minnesota House in 1982 and remember well his effective communication skills when he would hold the loyal opposition accountable on their tax and spending bills. I remember one occasion on the House floor late in the session in 1989 when his sharp rhetoric came across like an arrow before the House. He said, quote, "When, oh when, will the majority members of this House understand that the inscription above us, which says L'Etoile du Nord, the Star of the North, does not mean send the money north," said Gutknecht, because the Budget Committee was loaded with a train full of money to Minnesota's Iron Range. And Gil and I would both agree, Iron Range legislators, because they stuck together, were very, very effective in getting what they wanted. Finally, through the former U.S. House Members Association, Mr. Gutknecht has spoken to students on college campuses throughout the nation. From Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon, Mr. Gutknecht has spoken to students telling them that God has a plan for their lives, and that also on other critical issues facing our state and nation. Mr. Gutknecht will speak to us tonight on the issue of federalism. That's one of the issues he's going to speak about. The sharing of power between Washington and the states, along with other compelling national and state issues. With no further ado, it is my high honor to introduce to you former United States Congressman Gil Gutknecht.
Well, thank you, Professor Wenzel, and distinguished guests. I have to start with a little bit of housekeeping and share a few stories about former State Representative Steve Wenzel. I'll never forget when I was early in my legislative time in St. Paul, I was on a subcommittee and we were talking about rewriting the unemployment and workers' compensation laws for the state. Now, this was popular with a lot of employers, but it was very unpopular with the state's unions. They liked the system that they had helped put together. But we went around the state and we had some hearings. And we went up to Duluth. I'll never forget the night. It was a cold night. I remember that. And probably in January, late January, early February in Duluth. And the Iron Rangers had generously provided about 3 busloads of angry steelworkers. And they came down and the hearing became quite raucous. As a matter of fact, I was kind of, I thought at the time, I'm not sure we're going to get out of here without a fist fight. And so it was one of the most amazing committee hearings I'd ever been involved with. And so the next morning, when we finally, we stayed overnight in Duluth that night, and so the next morning we picked up the Duluth paper, believing that our hearing would be the #1 story on the news, on the front page of the newspaper. Lo and behold, when we opened the newspaper, we didn't have to open it. Right on the front page, the lead story was, and I quote, this was the headline, "Wenzel announces tax plan." Now, to you, that doesn't seem funny. In fact, maybe it isn't even funny, but it is so ironic. Because here you have a state representative from Little Falls going to Duluth, having a news conference on a tax plan, and he's not even a member of the tax committee. And when we looked for our story, it was like on page 8, and it was a little bitty story that says, House Committee has hearing in Duluth, and that was all it was. But I have to say, and when Steve asked me, and I'll try to call you Professor, but when Professor Wenzel asked me to speak here, I absolutely had to say yes, because I owe him so much. He has done so many things for me. When I was a member of Congress, one of the privileges that I had when the presidency changed hands was, as a member from the rural part of the state and a member of the House Ag Committee, I got to make recommendations for some of the key assignments in USDA. And one of them was for USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, State Director of Rural Development. And to the consternation of many, I recommended State Representative Steve Wenzel to that position. Now, that's kind of a plum, and there were a lot of folks who wanted that job. And they thought, oh my gosh, why are you giving it to Steve Wenzel? He's not even a member of our party. You know, these are jobs that are supposed to go to people who have been loyal to the party. But I knew him well enough to know that no one that I had ever met cared more for rural Minnesota than Steve Wenzel. And so I pushed for the appointment. Ultimately, George W. Bush appointed him, and I have grants for Minnesota for different things that were being developed here in Minnesota. For example, I don't know how many of you get down in the area in southwest Minnesota, but when we first started and he first started as rural development director, there weren't many wind turbines down there. If you go down there now, you will see lots and lots of wind turbines. Many of them were financed in whole or in part with loans and grants from USDA Rural Development. We were able, I shouldn't say we, I should say Professor Wenzel was able to get a lot of help for small communities, whether it was fire trucks, whether it was wastewater treatment plants, all kinds of things that have benefited rural Minnesota. And so I owe you a good deal, and I thank you. And I must say that I had never been on the campus here at Community Lakes College. Am I saying that right? Central Lakes College. I had never been on the campus here. I am amazed. This is such a beautiful campus. The buildings are all modern and well-maintained. And what a privilege it is for me to be with you tonight. A couple of other housekeeping stories that I want to share with you. I am going to do my best tonight not to be partisan, because I've been asked to talk about basically sort of give you a little bit of a history lesson in terms of the separation of powers between the states and the federal government and the whole concept of federalism, how it began, how it's operating today, and hopefully how it may operate in the future. But before I really get started, I should tell you that I cannot tell the whole story without talking about the importance of faith. Now, I am not a minister. I am, in fact, a sinner saved by grace, okay? I have no license to preach, but I think sometimes when you talk about history, you're missing the point if you don't discuss how important the role that faith played in the development of our government. Matter of fact, I will start with a question. How many of you know what was the first official act of the United States Congress the first time it ever came together to meet? Well, the answer is they appointed a chaplain. That was the very first thing that Congress did. The second thing they did is they prayed. And it wasn't a perfunctory prayer. They prayed for an hour and a half. And if you look at our founding fathers and if you read some of the documents and some of the things that they wrote at the time, there was no question that they were inspired by a power greater than any government. And I say all of this because you cannot talk about federalism without what I think are the other two really primary pillars. Think of it as a three-legged stool. It's faith, it's freedom, and it's federalism. And each one plays a role in how this great democratic experiment was founded and hopefully how it will survive going forward into the future. The first thing I should also tell you that I don't really give speeches so much. I don't even really give lectures. What I generally try to do when I speak at colleges is I tell stories. I do that for a variety of reasons. I think stories are easier for people to remember, and I think they help illustrate the points that I want to make. For the benefit of the students, let me put it that way. For the benefit of the students, I'm going to tell a story of one of my grandsons. We have 4 grandsons. 2 of them are twins. They're not identical twins. As I say, they're just 2 brothers who were born at the same time. They're about as different as night and day. One's a head taller than the other. But about a year and a half ago, they were staying at our house, and the older of the twin, he's 30 seconds older than the other one, and he's about a head taller than his brother, he got kind of a faraway look in his eye, and finally he says to me, "Grandpa, someday I want to be a millionaire." And I said, "Well, that's wonderful." I said, "You know, if you study real hard here in the United States, one day, you know, maybe you'll be a millionaire." He thought about that for a second. Finally, he says, "Grandpa, are you a millionaire?" Which is kind of an awkward question. I didn't know really how to answer it. I said, "Well, you know, I'm working on it." He thought about that for a second, and he said, "Maybe you should have studied harder." And so for the students' benefit, I really want to encourage you to study hard because, you know, here in the United States, it's amazing how far you can go. In my own personal example, I would never have dreamed when I was your age that I would one day become a member of the United States House, or I'm sorry, the Minnesota House of Representatives, and then be elected to the United States Congress and be able to serve 12 years. I've met a lot of interesting people. We were telling some stories at supper before we got down here. And it's just been a tremendous privilege, honor, and in many respects, a blessing for me to have served in Congress, which is also why I volunteer to go around and speak at colleges. This represents the 26th college campus that I've been on and had a chance to visit with students. As I mentioned, federalism, you can't talk about federalism unless you start with faith. And if you forget everything else that I say tonight, I hope you'll remember this story, because it's a true story. Now, you know, George Washington could not tell a lie. I can, but I try to avoid it, okay? But this is a true story. One of the things that Congress does, and we don't do it every year, it's almost like every other year that Congress will give out a Congressional Gold Medal. And one year, we gave that Congressional Medal to His All Holiness Bartholomew. Now, you probably don't even know who that is. His All Holiness Bartholomew is the head of, he's like the Pope of the Eastern Orthodox Church, okay? And he came to Washington to receive his medal, and I will never forget what he said in his remarks. His English wasn't perfect, but it was good enough you could easily understand what he was saying. He said the most important thing that he had learned after 40 years of wrestling with the godless communists, and they did everything they could to discourage religion and the practice of religion. He said the one thing that he had learned during that 40 years of wrestling with the communists is this. He said, faith can survive without freedom, but freedom cannot survive without faith. And I thought, wow, that is a powerful statement. So I hope you students especially will remember that, because faith and freedom are almost inseparable in my view, and we can talk more about that. Now, when you talk about how the the Continental Congress and ultimately the first Congress in the early days and the founders and the way they put this whole experiment together, they understood that the concept was that power, it was all about power. Government is really about the exercise of power. And they understood that all power flowed from Almighty God to the people. And the people loaned some of that power to the government. And they created the Constitution to protect that relationship. The power goes from, and this was a very unusual, almost unique point in history, because up until that point, the general feeling was that all power flowed to the king. And the king then gave certain amounts of power to the people. And in some of the countries, England, for example, power flowed from God to the king to the people. And the American experiment was that the power flowed from God to the people to the government. When I was first elected to Congress, there was a congressman from Texas by the name of Dick Armey. And Dick Armey became the majority leader for us when I was first there. And I'll never forget, this is a true story, and I don't know how I wound up feel now that the American people have given you all this power. And Dick Armey almost interrupted her and said, well, no. He said, the American people have given us responsibility. They loaned us power. And I think that's a very important thing that people need to remember, that, again, power flows from the people. The Constitution itself starts with the three most important words, we the people. It says, we the people of the United States. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But I want to talk more about the history of how we wound up with this concept of federalism, how we wound up with this Constitution. Because in many respects, it's a circuitous route. Some of you may remember, and I don't know how much you teach of this, Professor, but for a number of years, the colonies at the time were governed under the Articles of Confederation. The colonies were just a loose confederation. They didn't really consider themselves states yet, but they were held together by this Articles of Confederation. And it wasn't working out all that well because people began to realize, well, we needed some central government, okay? But how do you create a central government that doesn't become like the tyranny they had lived with Great Britain? And so they decided that they wanted to have a convention, if you will, in Philadelphia. And the purpose of the convention was to amend, to offer some amendments to the Articles of Confederation. But when they got there, they started talking about it, these delegates. And by the way, not everybody even took this meeting seriously. Rhode Island did not even send a delegation. So it was kind of an odd group that came together in Philadelphia to talk about amending the Articles of Confederation. And when they got there, as the more they discussed, they said, you know, you really can't fix this thing with the Articles of Confederation. What we really need is a whole new Constitution. So they started in late spring in Philadelphia in 1787. In the late spring of 1787, they got together and they kept meeting throughout the entire summer. And they did it behind closed doors. And they literally closed the windows, locked the doors, so no one on the outside knew what was going on inside. And here they were writing an entirely new Constitution. The debates that they had were incredibly fractious. Let's use that word. I mean, there were heated arguments, supposedly, behind those closed doors. And the arguments mostly centered on how much power was going to be given to this new federal government and how much was going to be retained by the states and the people. And that was the central argument, but there were a lot of other arguments. They had a lot of other things. Slavery was still on the discussion table. What are you going to do with the slaves? What are you going to do with slave states? As you appropriate, or as you apportion for seats in the Congress, are you going to count slaves? Well, slaves weren't really considered, you know, they weren't considered human beings. I mean, a slave didn't have any power. Should they be counted in terms of the, and so ultimately they agreed, this was a compromise, that slaves would be counted as 3/5 citizens. And that was part of the compromise. There were a lot of compromises, but there were an awful lot of fights. And one day, the story is that there was a very heated argument going on in this convention that ultimately became a constitutional convention, and it had become quite acrimonious. So finally, at the back of the room, Benjamin Franklin rose, and he said something that changed the attitude of everybody who was there. He said, "Let us, Mr. Speaker, contemplate our own fallibilities." And it made everybody think. And so they calmed down, and they began to work together to put this Constitution together. But the real debate was, and I'm not trying to get too deep into just the nuts and bolts of the history, but the argument was really between the Federalists, who wanted a fairly strong central federal government, and those who wanted a less federal government, or as minimalist as they possibly could get, and they were referred to as the anti-federalists. Now, when they finally reached agreement on a compromise, they recognized that there were 13 colonies/states, and in order to get it ratified, they were going to have to get 9 states to ratify. Now, the people from Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia had already signaled that they were much more in the the corner of the anti-federalist. They didn't particularly like the Constitution, the way it was written. They argued aggressively against it. And there was great fear that the Constitution would not be ratified by the states. In fact, the first draft of the Constitution said, "We the people of the states," and then it listed the names of the states. Well, the final draft, which I think is much, much better, said, "We the people of the United States." And it's easy for us to forget sometimes that we are the United States of America. And as they argued about this after the Constitution had actually been approved by this convention in Philadelphia, and ultimately was approved by the Continental Congress and referred back to the states for ratification, they needed 9 states, and they didn't know if they could get them. They were afraid that both New York and Virginia would vote against it, and that would be enough to actually kill. If Massachusetts stuck with them, it would make it almost impossible to get it passed. So they asked, well, what is it going to take to get this thing approved by the states? And the answer was, they said, well, what we really want is to make it even more specific. We want you to put together a group of amendments that clearly identify the powers that will go to the states, or that goes to the federal government, and how much of the power is going to be retained by the states. Now, this is something that is so misunderstood, and every time I hear news people talking about this, and I even hear, elected officials who really don't understand the Electoral College. One of the agreements was that the Congress, the House of Representatives, would be elected by the people. You cannot be appointed to the U.S. House of Representatives. Every member that's ever sat in the U.S. House of Representatives has been elected by the people in his district or her district, okay? Senators, and this is also largely forgotten, but true nonetheless, for over 100 years, senators were elected by the state legislatures. We often hear about Abraham Lincoln and how he lost 2 Senate elections. And we tend to think, and the media doesn't quite help clarify this, we tend to think that Abraham Lincoln was, lost 2 general elections for the United States Senate. No, he lost the elections in the state legislature. And in fact, both times he had commitments from enough state legislators to be elected to the U.S. Senate, and some of them changed their minds and he wound up losing. But he didn't lose a popular vote in the state of Illinois for the U.S. Senate because the senators were elected by the state legislatures. So the House is elected by the people. The Senate was elected by the state legislatures until 1913. It was the 17th Amendment to the Constitution that allowed direct election of U.S. senators. But it has always been the case that the President of the United States is elected by the states. That's what the you know, all the arguments over, well, yeah, it should so-and-so, and it should be having electoral college. No, that is in the Constitution, and it's there for a reason, and it was part of the compromise, that the states were not going to give up that much power to an executive branch if they didn't have something to say about how that executive was elected. Fortunately, we had some amazing human beings, and none less amazing than George Washington. George Washington was, you know, we call him the father of our country. In many respects, he deserves that title because George Washington had a number of amazing leadership qualities, but probably his best quality was he was an unbelievably good listener. And he listened to people, and he tried to understand where they were coming from and see if there was a way that they could compromise and perhaps keep the ball moving forward. So when he was chosen to sort of lead and preside over the Constitutional Convention, he was exactly the right choice. And Washington was such a critical force, not only in getting the Constitution written, but ultimately in getting it approved. But most people don't know, he didn't really win a popular vote to become our first president, okay? Again, it was the states who put together delegations that ultimately elected George Washington to be our president. We talked about those 10 amendments, and originally there were 12. But the 10 that survived all enumerate what the powers are and how much is retained by the people. I mean, the First Amendment is about our ability to say what we believe, and particularly political free speech is unchecked by the Constitution. Now, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, that's true. But when it comes to political speech, there are almost no things that you can't say in the United States of America under the First Amendment. But as you go through the 10 amendments, the capstone is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment says, this may not be in exact words, but it's very, very close, that all powers not specifically granted to the federal government are retained by the states and to the people. So in other words, if it doesn't say that the Congress and the federal government have the power in the Constitution to do things, then that power is retained by the states and the people. We have gone a long ways from that, and basically for a long time, that's the way that, you know, the world worked. The federal government didn't have that much power. I mean, they could declare war, they could levy taxes, they could deliver the mail. When Thomas Jefferson, talking about faith, when Thomas Jefferson was president, a lot of people, this is one of the most interesting things about Jefferson because, and there are a lot of interesting things about him, but when he was president of the United States, he had the responsibility because Washington, D.C. was turning into not a city, but a pretty good-sized village. One of the responsibilities, and it was all under the direction because it was a separate district. It wasn't a state. It was never designed to be a state. We have those arguments too. But Thomas Jefferson, among other of his responsibilities, he was in effect the superintendent of the Washington, D.C. public schools. And one of the interesting things about Jefferson was, while he was acting as superintendent of the Washington, D.C. public schools, one of his jobs was to determine what books they would use in the schools. And he authorized, one of the books that he authorized for use in the Washington, D.C. public schools, in fact, he ordered, I forget how many copies, of the Holy Bible. Kind of surprises you, right? One of the other things about the Congress itself in the Capitol, many people don't know this. First of all, there is a chapel in the United States Capitol building. Most people don't know that. And when I would do tours, if I had time, I would try to take the students or tour groups that were coming through and show them the chapel. And in that chapel, virtually every president since the Capitol was finished before he goes out on the western steps to take the oath of office, I believe every president, since it was opened, has gone into that chapel and spent some time in prayer before he actually takes the oath of office. And it's right on the way. The other thing that people don't know about the Capitol, that over 100 years, the Capitol, the chamber, the old House chamber, where the Congress met for about 100 years, every Sunday it was used for religious services. Kind of surprising, isn't it? In fact, when the first Congress came together, I mentioned that what their first official acts were. Many people don't know the first Speaker of the House was a gentleman by the name of Muhlenberg, and he was an ordained minister. So the impact and the effect of faith on our government is almost unmistakable. But the 10th Amendment is really the critical one we're talking about tonight, and that's where this whole concept of federalism came from, okay? It tried to restrict this relationship between the states and the federal government. But what we've seen, that's sort of how this all got started, but what we've seen over the decades and over the hundreds of years, the federal government has done what our founders suspected it would do. It has acquired more and more power. It has moved into doing lots of things which were never really, in my judgment, never envisioned for the federal government to do. I'll give you one example, and this is controversial, and I can probably give you several controversial ones. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that either the Congress or the courts have it within their power to define marriage. That clearly, in my opinion, was left up to the states. That's just one small area where we've seen encroachment. And what has really happened over the years is that you've seen whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's a war, whenever there's something that scares the people, I mean, if I can say it that way, the federal government is there to say, oh, no, we can solve that problem. We can solve that problem if we just have enough money and we have the power to tax and we can create a new agency, and so it goes. The Federal Department of Education, I don't see anything other than the fact that we are responsible for the Washington, D.C. public schools, because the federal government actually operates like a state government over the city of Washington. But beyond that, I'm not sure why the federal government should have a Department of Education. That's me, but if you look at the Constitution and you look at the 10th Amendment and you begin to say, okay, why are we involved in so many of these things? Why are there so many federal laws? Most of the things that people can be convicted of and go to jail for really should probably be state laws. The state should retain the power to determine how long you should go to jail for certain crimes. Again, that's partly my opinion, but that opinion is based on looking at the history of the 10th Amendment and the Constitution and the separation of powers. So federalism has been eroded dramatically. In fact, I would argue that part of the reason that we're running at $34 trillion in debt is largely because the federal government has stepped up to do things that it's not very well equipped to do. In fact, if you look at virtually every one of the federal departments, they're relatively ham-fisted in whatever they try to accomplish. See, the founders believed, and I really agree with them, that the best government is the government that governs least, but if you need government, the most effective and most representative government is the government that's closest to you. It's much easier for you to get a hold of your local state representative than it is for you to get a hold of your congressmen or senators, okay? And so more of that power should now, I believe, be returned back to the states and allow them to make decisions. I mentioned that part of the reason that the power has been centralized and the federal government has absorbed so much of this power and is doing so many things is because of, emergencies, wars. When we had September 11th, all of a sudden, we've got to have more, lots more regulations. We got to control what people do and what they can carry on airplanes. and that is interstate commerce. And so, yeah, I guess, yeah, we've got to let them do that. But it went well beyond that. The federal government started doing things after 9/11 that they probably wouldn't be doing otherwise. In fact, one of my colleagues famously said, "Never let a tragedy go to waste." And there's a certain amount of truth to that. But there's also some truth, and you need to, I want to make this clear. It isn't just that the federal government is grabbing additional powers. It's that many times the states want to give it to them. And the reason is we've had relatively weak governors in many of the states, and they don't want to be held accountable for some of the things that need to be done. And so they've actually cooperated with the federal government and allowed it to grow and sort of step beyond the bounds of the original thought of federalism. I think I'm going to stop here pretty quick, and because I want to take some questions. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. You can ask whatever question you want to ask, but I just want to say it would be wholly inadequate for the governing of any other. I'll just repeat that. Our Constitution was intended for a moral and religious people. It would be wholly inadequate for the governing of any others. And finally, after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was wrapping up, Benjamin Franklin was coming out of the meeting, and there was a local who caught up to him and he said, "Dr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And he said something rather profound. He said, "A republic, if you can keep it." You know, at the end of the day, it's up to us to keep this republic. And I think it's important for us to understand the division of powers. It's important for us to understand the concept of federalism. And it's important for us to understand that, you know, the federal government, as I say, is not very good at many of the things it tries to do. And I can probably give you some examples of that. So we have a republic, if we can keep it. I'll stop there and we'll take some questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hold on 1 second.
Oh, well, hold on. We'll have Mike. There's a mic here. If I can turn it on. I've got water, thanks. I'll repeat the question if you want. Here we go.
Test. 1, 2, 1, 2. It's me. And now 35. Would you give 40 now 5?
All right, here we go.
I've been studying history for my entire life, listening to people speak about the Constitution. Talking with Buford Johnson here, and Buford, it just kind of woke me up a little bit. I always read what was written, but not the why. Can you expound on the why? Different things in the Constitution, like the Second Amendment. You know, I know what the Second Amendment is. I know what the First Amendment is. But why was it written? Like the 10th Amendment, the why.
Well, I'll talk about the Second Amendment. I mean, all of the amendments are about tyranny, okay? They had lived under tyranny. They had to put British soldiers in their homes, and they had to feed them, even though they didn't like them, okay? They considered that tyranny. They considered taxation without representation to be tyranny. And the way you stop tyranny is by having a well-armed militia, okay? Tyrants fear peasants with pitchforks. They fear peasants with rifles even more. So it was all about almost all of the Bill of Rights and the essence, the why of the Constitution was to prevent us from ever having that kind of tyranny here in the United States. They didn't want a king. One of the story
George Washington. Now, history, I can't prove this with history, okay? This is one of those anecdotes that's been repeated, and it may be urban legend, but it's such a good story. I tell it anyway. Washington, when he became president, there were a number of people in the Continental Congress and friends and, people who said, well, they wondered, what are we going to call him, okay? And generally, the feeling was they wanted to call him Your Royal Highness. And Washington would have none of that, okay? Because, that really sounded like he was the new king. And he didn't want to be a new king. He didn't want a king at all. He had spent a good part of his life. Another thing about Washington, Washington was a fabulous salesman. If you don't think he was a great salesman, consider this. He had to go out and recruit people to fight against the most powerful army and navy in the world, okay? Now that's a great sales job. But beyond that, when he had to tell people the truth, because remember, he couldn't lie. And he had to tell them, look, if we win the war, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay you. And if we lose the war, they're going to hang us from the highest tree. And yet he was able to recruit the forces to fight. But when they said to him, what should we call you? How about Your Royal Highness? He said, no. He said, you may call me Mr. President, because I will preside until the true king returns. Pretty powerful statement. That's the kind of man that George Washington was. I don't know if that helps to answer your question. Thanks. Oh, test. Maybe I better stand back here.
Another question? There we go.
Yep.
Today is National Indian Day, and we say we the people. Doesn't say all the people, doesn't say everyone. And so there's an exclusion clause there. So if everyone's included, and that must mean us all. So a bunch of white dudes got together and decided they were going to form a country, and they had to come up with Articles of Confederation. They had to get a plan of unity, and they had to keep the ground. So, I don't know, explain that. Explain all and everyone. Why is it excluded?
I'm sorry, who is excluded? Indians? Black people?
All the people within the continental United States.
Okay, no, okay. It's hard for us, and I understand your point. It's a good point. I mean, when they said we the people, it was a limited number, mostly white people, mostly business people. I get that. They were mostly merchants and relatively wealthy farmers and planters. I think that's your point, right?
And it's kind of like, what's your definition of Christianity? What type of Christianity are you talking about? You're talking about Baptists, you're talking about Lutherans. They get together and form a country, exclude Muslims, Cherokee, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe. You have to understand that the country that you're talking about doesn't have any modern conveniences. You have horses, you have this, and you have to pull these colonies together. So you have to come up with a government where everyone takes care of each other in case of an emergency or whatever, and that's what happened last week. We had an emergency, and the states got together and tried to help the people in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and that's what federal governments do. They try to form unity within the group. So why didn't they use all and everyone when they wrote that Constitution up?
Well, I can't speak to that. I understand your point, and it's well taken. I mean, but the whole idea was these weren't perfect people. And for that day and age, things were, things are different today than they were then, right? I mean, we see things a little bit differently than they did, but they tried to be inclusive with everybody. But one of the most important parts, I think, of the democratic experiment was the whole concept of equal justice under the law. And if you look at other countries, so many of them were ruled by kings or monarchs or some kind of, and the law was what they said the law was. Well, at least we have a system now where laws are written by representatives of the people, and when the laws are wrong, they can be repealed or they can be amended. So it isn't we say in order to form a more perfect union, okay? It doesn't mean that it's perfect, and it isn't perfect today. But I will say that if you compare our system of government, in fact, I think even Winston Churchill said, it's not the perfect form of government, but it's better than every other form of government that's been tried. So I don't think you should allow the imperfect to become the enemy of the very good. I don't know if that probably doesn't answer your question. I understand your point. It wasn't all the people. That's true. But we've come a long way to try and include more of the people in the greater discussion about our future.
You briefly mentioned the Electoral College,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a concern that it might be eliminated. What would that take? What would it take? And should we be?
Constitutional amendment.
Okay, so that has to be done through Congress.
Right. It would have to be ratified by 2/3 of the members of Congress, and then it would have to be approved by 2/3 of the members of Congress and 3/4 of the states. The likelihood that that's going to happen, I mean, I can't possibly see a way that states like North Dakota or South Dakota or even Minnesota, I can't imagine that Minnesota would give away the power that it has right now relative to big states like California, New York, and Illinois, and even Florida. Yeah, in the back. I'm sorry.
Hang on one second.
She was, yeah.
Do you think there are any amendments that are outdated? And if you do you think they should have an updated constitution?
Okay, I think I got the question right. Do I think there are things that are outdated in the Constitution that need to be rewritten? My short answer is no. No. I mean, the most amazing thing about this Constitution is how durable it has been, okay? And again, if you think about it in terms of power and in terms of checks and balances, I mean, it isn't perfect, but trying to perfect it from where it is today, you might make things worse. And so, no, I cannot think of a single thing in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights or in the amendments in general that I would change. Yeah. Maybe I should go back to you. What would you like to see changed? Okay, all right, thanks.
First off, just want to say thank you for coming out. Obviously, our founding fathers were super bright individuals, but do you think if they were still around today, would they be proud of our country, or if not, like, what would they want to change of what's going on in our country?
That is a great question. I've never really thought about that. I think they would be proud because, most of the things that they dreamed of in terms of, Americans being able to pursue their dreams, like no other country in the world. In the United States of America, there's so many examples of young people like yourselves that came from relatively, humble beginnings that have gone on to achieve some amazing things. And like no other country in the world. If you go to Europe and you, for example, I've spent quite a bit of time with the Germans. The Germans, it's a different culture, and it's a wonderful culture, but it doesn't have the opportunity that the United States does. When you're, I think in 6th grade, you take some tests, and they determine whether you're going to go to trade school or whether you're going to go to college. Your whole future is pretty well mapped out. Maybe that's a good idea, but I kind of like the idea here in the United States that you get to chart your own course, and you get to, make your own mistakes. So I think in general they would be proud. I think they would be, I have to believe they're rolling over in their graves, that the federal government has gotten so big that it now runs a national debt and a deficit that is mind-boggling. I think I am appalled, okay? As Professor Wenzel mentioned, I was very proud to have been a part of a Congress that not only balanced the budget in 4 consecutive years, he is correct, first time that's been done in 100 years that Congress balanced its budget. We didn't just balance the budget, we paid down $500 billion worth of publicly held debt. Now, I don't want to go on too much about that, except to say this. One of my favorite expressions is that success leaves clues. And this is also for the benefit of your students. If you want to learn how to be more successful, study successful people, okay? If you want to learn how to do anything, find people who are already doing it successfully and try to model yourself after them, okay? Success leaves clues. People who say, well, the federal government can never balance its budget again. That is just pure nonsense. It can balance its budget again. It can do it in less than 5 years. And I can give them the formula. It's relatively simple. People don't understand what we did in 1994 to balance the budget. It was a real simple formula. And it started with a question. Why should the federal budget grow at a faster rate than the average family budget? And nobody had an answer for that. The answer is it shouldn't. And so if you slow the rate of growth in federal spending to less than the growth in the average family budget, what will happen is the economy will take off. The economy will grow. The federal government will actually generate more revenue. You can actually lower taxes and increase revenue if you allow Americans to do what they do best, and that is to grow, to build, whether growing crops or raising cattle, whatever. Americans have an unbelievable propensity to produce, okay, if we just get out of their way. And so in a relatively short period of time, you could balance the budget and you could start paying down that debt again. And the best thing about it is most of the things that you would eliminate or trim, the American public would not miss at all. For example, one of the things we did when I was there, and this is one of my tasks, is to go through a lot of these little agencies and find out whether or not we really need them anymore, okay? And this is a good example. One of the things that the federal government had when I went to Washington was a National Coffee Tasters Commission. You're on your own now. We don't do that anymore. Did you miss that? There are a whole lot of things the federal government does that the federal government should probably let the states do or just not do at all. So success leaves clues. I hope you'll remember that as well.
I'm a coffee drinker and I don't like that.
If it was a relatively easy formula, why won't they replicate it now, and what's stopping them from doing that?
Great question. Great question. Why don't they do it? They don't want to do it, okay? Because there are thousands of lobbyists in Washington, and almost all of them have one goal, and that is to get a piece of the federal budget, all right? Whether they'll admit it or not, that's really what they're trying to do, okay? They're all lobbying for, look, you know, as long as you're going to spend, $10 billion on this, make sure that I get my money for my group, okay, or whatever. There's almost nobody out there representing the taxpayers. There's one small group, and they're very ineffective, that is eager to help try to balance a budget, and they do a miserable job. And I've tried to help them, and they're beyond help. I mean, they just are not good at telling their story. But I think it's a good story. And I don't know what's going to happen after this election. Nobody really knows, okay? But there's a German term, write this down too, remember this. There's a German term called Zeitgeist. It literally translates time ghost, the spirit of the times. And it sort of goes back to those 3 magic words, we the people. The Congress will balance the budget again when we, the people, demand that they do it, okay? And I think we're reaching that point again, where we, the people, are going to demand that Congress get back to fiscal sanity. One of the real problems we have right now, and I don't want, when I start talking about the budget, I know people's eyes start to glaze over and they're looking at their watch. But I want to make this point. One of the things that's happened in the last 8 to 10 years is the Federal Reserve has started to monetize the federal debt, okay? In other words, they either are printing more money or they're borrowing money, but they're covering for the wasteful spending of the Congress. It used to be they had to sell all the bonds, and the Chinese bought all the bonds. Or not, wasn't just Chinese. Chinese bought a lot of bonds. Chinese don't buy our bonds anymore, okay? So what are they going to do? So they print more money. And people are, I'm amazed, smart people don't understand why we have inflation today. We have inflation today because they spent $5 trillion they didn't have on programs that mostly don't work, and they went to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve said, well, okay, we'll print another $5 trillion. If you print more money, each dollar is worth less. That's called inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods raises prices. And it's reflected in real estate, it's reflected in the stock market, it's reflected in groceries, it's reflected in gas, it's reflected in everything. And so people have to begin to make that connection that until Congress gets its budget house in order, we're going to have inflation, and we're probably going to have a weaker economy than we otherwise would have had. I apologize for getting too professorial on that, but it's one of my pet peeves.
What was it like to run against Tim Walz for representative? And based on that, do you think that makes him a good vice presidential candidate?
I literally go out of my way. I do a lot of radio shows. I write, as Steve mentioned, I write for townhall.com. I give a lot of speeches, but I studiously avoid talking about Tim Walz. And there are a lot of reasons, but I will say this, okay? It was the most frustrating campaign that I have ever been involved with, and for a whole variety of reasons. Number one, he had no record. We didn't know where he stood on anything, okay, which makes it very difficult. Number two, it was a terrible year for Republicans. George W. Bush was about as popular in my district, you know, as foot fungus. You know, I mean, he volunteered to come in and do an event for me, and we said, no, we don't want you to come in. You're at 37% approval in my district. So I will just, that's as much as I will say. I'm all right, I'm going to say one more thing. If I had known then what I know now, it might have come out different. That's all. I'm sorry. I probably shouldn't have said that. Anytime I start a sentence with I shouldn't say this, I probably really shouldn't say that. Go ahead.
Do you feel that the First Amendment has already been in jeopardy or jeopardized, or is in future danger of being jeopardized by the censorship that's taken place on social media platforms?
Yes, and I think the best thing that's happened to the First Amendment and to the American democratic experiment was when Elon Musk bought Twitter and renamed it. I don't know why he renamed it X, but I think he really is committed to totally free speech, and by doing that, he has put tremendous pressure on the other social media platforms. Okay, and so I think all of them are going to raise their game, and I think that's good. So yes, I mean, and one of my big concerns though is the media in general. Now, I'm not so naive to say that, you know, the media was a lot fairer, you know, back whenever. I think the media has always been unfair. If you read some of the articles that they wrote about Abraham Lincoln, they called him a baboon, they called him all kinds of names. So I think the history of the media being relatively unfair one way or the other is pretty well replete. I mean, the term yellow journalism was not created, you know, 10 years ago. It's been around for hundreds of years. We just have to learn to deal with it. Let me add one more thing about the First Amendment. Because here's another quote from Thomas Jefferson you might want to remember. He said, "Give the people the truth, and the republic will be saved." And so what the American people have to have access to is information. They can determine for themselves which is true and which isn't. But we don't really need, talking heads on Sunday morning trying to decide for us what's true and what's not.
All right, so what I'm concerned about here is basically our nation's divided, and what I'm wondering is how does that affect federalism? Because some states lean one way, some lean another, and that makes it hard to compromise, especially since no one wants to compromise, like neither side. How do we strike a balance or a compromise between federal control and the states? Because it seems to swing either only completely one way or the other, but not a middle ground.
That's a great question, and in fact, you actually helped me answer the question, okay? Thank you. I don't know if you know this or not, but the Greeks did not write history. You know why? Because they believed that history just repeated itself. You would have wars, and then you would have peace. You would have droughts, and then you would have, abundant crops. That there was a pendulum effect in history. And I believe they were right. And I believe there is a pendulum. And you will see things go too far one way, and then the body politic will push it back the other way. So you will never reach a perfect balance. And reaching compromise is difficult. But what you will see, I think, ultimately, is this pendulum effect throughout history. And the arc of history demonstrates that on a lot of different fronts. So in many respects, I think you kind of answered your own question. The pendulum will swing back. It will swing back to the center, but only for a moment. Then it will go the other way. So that's the way it works.
Professor Wenzel said in class that you accurately predicted Trump's winning the nomination and then the presidency all the way in 2015. And so how did you know it was going to happen all the way before he did it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Wenzel. A great economist once said that the key to being an effective economist is to predict often, but seldom in writing, okay? And I think it's true in politics as well. I think, that was one where I don't know why. I'll give you a little bit of a history, and Mary, stop me if I start going on too long here, but Mary and I were invited to a candidate forum down in Des Moines, and that year, very early in the campaign cycle, because Iowa has the first in the nation caucuses, and so all the, I think 14 Republican candidates for president showed up at an auditorium about the size of this. And we were invited, and we sat sort of in the middle, and we listened to all of them. And there were some great candidates. I mean, Ted Cruz he is a spellbinder sometimes. He had the audience. He was doing a great job. And there were a number of them that were like that. They gave great campaign speeches. And then this guy gets up, and I had never watched The Apprentice. I had read Donald Trump's book, but I didn't really know that much about him. He gets up and he gives this terrible speech. He just sort of rambles on, and it's like, oh my gosh, what is this guy doing? Is this a joke? I mean, he really thinks he can run for president against all these, polished and accomplished other politicians. And then later that year, I was invited. I used to always go down, and Congressman Steve King in Northwest Iowa had a pheasant hunt. Okay, and if it was a presidential year, and because a lot of politicos would come from all over to hunt pheasants on this beautiful area that it was the best pheasant hunting you'll ever have. And I know how to load a gun, and I know how to shoot a gun, okay? And so I love to go down to his pheasant hunts. And the one year, there were like 5 or 6 of the presidential candidates who came to the pheasant hunt. Several of them hunted with us, okay? Ted Cruz is a great shot. I don't think he missed all day. And but along with them came this huge gaggle of press. I mean, there was local press, there was press from the Des Moines Register, Sioux City papers, and television, and all the networks were there too. And they're out there walking along behind us as we're out hunting pheasants all day. And at the end, then they had like a little news conference, and all of the various presidential candidates who had come that day got 5 minutes in front of the Klieg lights and the cameras, and maybe got 30 seconds on the nightly news that night. So I'm standing there watching all this, and there's a reporter from the local radio station. And he's covering all these guys as they come through there in northwest Iowa. And I just said to him, I said, what do you see going on? He said, well, let me tell you something. He said, we've got this civic center in Lamars, Iowa, and it holds, 400 people. And he said, so-and-so candidate was here a few weeks ago, and he drew about 200 people. And then one of the other candidates was here, and they drew about 300 people. But he said, Trump came to town, and he drew over 1,000 people. They couldn't all get in. I thought, wow, 1,000 people in Lamars, Iowa, that's quite a turnout. And then the other thing that happened, we were invited to dinner at a friend of ours, and she's a Republican, but she's not. If you were going to pick a Trumpist out of a crowd, you wouldn't pick her, okay? She's a business person, she's a solid person, but not somebody you would think of as wearing a red hat, okay? Anyway, we're at dinner, and she says to me, she says, well, how do you think Trump's doing? I said, well, he's drawing some pretty good-sized crowd. Oh, she says, I know. We drove down to Mason City to see him, and we're going to drive down, to the next rally, wherever it was. I mean, she's driving 150 miles to go to a Trump rally. And that's when I realized there's something going on here that I have never seen before, and I don't really understand. And so when I was at the University of Maine, and a question like this came up, one of the students said, hey, who do you think is the dark horse and most likely to ultimately win the Republican nomination? And my answer was, right now, I think the guy that you ought to really keep an eye on is Donald J. Trump. He said, I said, I think he wants to run. I think he wants it so badly. And I think he appeals to a whole different group of Republicans. And so that's how that all sort of happened. And I was not a Trump fan. In fact, to be honest, a lot of college students say to me, well, do you like Donald Trump? And my answer usually is, as a human being, I don't know I could say that I like him. But I do agree with his policies, and I think he's been an effective president in what he's done. And so do I support him? Absolutely, okay? But he's got a prickly personality that's hard to like. Yes, sir. Oh.
So I know that you mentioned earlier that there's like a lot of subjects, like I found it kind of funny how you're like trying to avoid the subject of Tim Walz, because like I myself, like my mother's a teacher and she doesn't really like him because he's imposed like new policies for like there's new training required, and if you don't pass, you're not allowed to teach for a while actually, and you have to retake it or whatever. My mother, she has to get like 80% on a test or whatever to keep teaching, which is kind of scary for her. She doesn't know what's going to happen. But while I'm not the biggest fan, I know that it's like other people see him in a different light, and that's like okay. Like I know that I have bias against him, but other people are allowed to think in different ways. And the problem is that sometimes I'll see like signs for like Harris, Tim Walz, and then I'll see like an X on it. It's like, okay, I get you don't agree, but you can't go out there doing that stuff. And I've seen that a lot where like, I know for a long time there's been several subjects that have been uncomfortable, like Israel versus Palestine. That has been a huge thing on college campuses that has caused immense amounts of protest, erupting into crazy amounts of violence. And I think that's what's prevented a lot of people from talking about like more serious political matters. So what do you do when you fear violence happening, or what do you do when you know you're talking about an uncomfortable subject and you think that there might be a danger posed to people who talk about it?
Boy, these are great questions. I don't have a perfect answer. I can tell you how I deal with it. I try to deal with it respectfully, okay? I try to respect people, and if anything, I would hope Professor Wenzel would agree with me, that when I was in the Minnesota House, I could be quite aggressive. But I also tried to be respectful of the other side. And I also tried to listen to their arguments, okay? And sometimes they made sense, but usually I could find a way to say, you know, I understand how you feel, but if you're interested, I will share how I feel and why I feel that way, okay? Now, I had the advantage, I've been to sales training programs. I started out as a salesman. I also became an auctioneer. I really can do the, and now 35, but you get 40, now 5, but I'm at 45, but you get 50. I can really do that, okay? So in my sales training programs, I learned something very important. And if you're interested in politics, this is probably the two most important things you can learn if you're going to go into politics is, number one, empathy. Empathy. Empathy is the most important word in politics, and the word empathy means you understand how somebody feels. Sympathy means you feel the way somebody feels. But Bill Clinton, for example, was a fabulous politician. Just fabulous. And it was partly because he had so much empathy. He understood how average people felt, okay? But I think if you can deal with empathy with people, and if you can be respectful of them, even when they're disrespectful to you, okay? And the other thing that I wanted to point out that I learned in sales training was that people in general, Americans in particular, do not change their minds, okay? Now, that is something, once I learned this, it was like, wow, it opened the doors. People do not change their minds. What they will do is they will make a new decision based on additional information. So when you say to somebody, I understand how you feel. Sometimes I can say, I felt that way myself, all right? But then I learned that boom, boom, boom. And I also began to learn that boom, 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 boom. And so once I had learned that, it was like I could never quite feel the same way about that issue that I feel about it now. Now, I'm not saying you can change the way I did, but I'm just telling you that's how I went about it. Or, you know, if you could say, you know, have you ever thought, this is one way you can say to people, have you ever considered, for example, this is an argument you can all, whether, I started to say whatever side of the argument you're on, but there's really only one side this argument probably works for. But when people talk about reproductive rights or abortion or however they want to refer it, one of the things that I would often say to people, are you aware that it's up to a $100,000 fine to destroy the unborn egg of an eagle in the United States of America? Were you aware of that? When people think about that, it makes them think about the whole issue a little bit differently. You don't have to argue with them. Just, are you aware of that? And that's a fact. You know, you can Google that. And so once people, if you can get people to think about things in a slightly different way, you can potentially persuade them. But, you know, politics, people have, you know, politics and religion, people have pretty strong feelings about. And many times, you know, they're going to do what they're going to do, and you just have to say, God bless you, you know? I don't know if that's, I hope that's helpful.
You mentioned earlier that you think social media is hurting this country or along those lines. And I'm just wondering, because you see all these like news stations like CNN or Fox News, they say things about both sides of the political like world. Those both say bad things. And I'm just wondering, because like I talk to people around and they said like they don't want to vote because people say this about this person or people say this about that person. So I'm just wondering, like, do you feel like, because then like sorry like they'll say, oh, Trump did this or Kamala did this, and like Trump was a bad husband. Well, we're not voting for him as the best husband ever. We're voting for him as president. Or Kamala did this, but we're voting for him as president. Do you feel like Now this comes with the First Amendment, so it's kind of like, I don't know. But I feel like, do you feel like if Congress passed a law saying that all news stations had to be accurate with their information, that there'd be less?
No, I'll stop you right there. No, Congress should pass no law restricting the First Amendment.
Okay.
ABC News.
I'm not saying like people can have their own opinion, but I'm just saying like news stations putting out true information and not saying like false things about such and such would make people want to vote.
What I would, well, yeah, I'd be very careful about that. But what I would say is there may be a role for the stations to police some of the ads. Okay, they may be they perhaps hate it. Okay, but the consultants all say it works, okay? If you want to win in a tight race, you've got to, the word that they use is define your opponent, okay? And defining your opponent is to say that they're, a low-down scoundrel and they will steal horses if they're given half a chance, so don't vote for him because we don't want to give them that chance. And things like that. I do think negative advertising has negative consequences that the consultants don't want to talk about. And I think you've touched on it. I think it turns an awful lot of people off to being involved in the democratic process completely, and that's, that's too bad.
You said that the Constitution was written. Is it working now?
Yes, test.
Speak into it real loud.
Okay, is it working? Okay. You said that, quote, the Constitution was written behind closed doors. You also said that power flows from the people to the government. So do you think that the general population of the then colonies should have played a larger role in deciding the body to govern them?
What I think now, it doesn't really matter because that's the way it was done. Was that the way I would have done it? I don't know. I mean, it's really hard for us to judge those people in those times for what they did. They believed that we needed a constitution and that if we opened it up to the public, there'd be fistfights throughout Philadelphia and they would never get it done. That's what they believed. Now, I don't know if they were right or not, and I'm not here to second guess them.
Okay, so there's like a lot of people out there who believe that their vote won't matter because they're just one individual and one vote. So I'm just wondering what you would say to those people to kind of encourage them to vote or explain why their vote does matter.
You can tell them that, that Gil Gutknecht won his first election to the U.S. House of, or to the Minnesota House of Representatives in the primary. He won that election by 21 votes. Every vote mattered. And there are a lot of elections. In fact, if you look, I think I'm correct. I'm trying to remember which presidential election, it may have been the last one, was actually decided by one vote per precinct in like 5 states. So one vote makes a lot of difference. And either way, I mean, I think people, if you're going to be a citizen, part of the price of being a citizen is to be an informed citizen who actually participates in the democratic process. And I do object. It does bother me a bit when I see these ads on TV and I see, NFL players and other people say, vote, vote, vote. No, I don't think you just vote, okay? I think you get informed. Make sure you understand, which candidates best represent your views and your values, all right? I will tell you, and are you voting this year for the first time? Oh my gosh. All right, well, but the bottom line is, when you go in there, a lot of times you'll see they're like 3rd District Court judge. And I don't know any of those guys, okay? I don't know who they are. Or, Board of Supervisors. Some of the, I'll tell you, I'll confess, some of those races where I don't know the candidates and I don't know anything about them, I don't vote in those races. Because I don't think I should mess it up for people who do. I mean, there are a lot of people who really know a lot about Judge so-and-so. I don't know anything about him. And that's my fault. I haven't spent enough time to really study the candidates. But you're not compelled to vote in every race, okay? But, you know, when it's president, you probably have a pretty good idea who you think would do the best job. Probably your local congressman, you have a pretty good idea. Maybe U.S. senator. I mean, so at least vote in the ones
Sheriff.
you really know.
Sheriff.
Sheriff, absolutely.
I lost by 6 votes, so every vote does matter.
But you didn't give up.
Which candidate in the upcoming election do you think is the most well-spoken in foreign policy and the best suited for communicating with other countries to prevent nuclear war?
Well, I try not to get partisan, but to me, it's not even close. It's J.D. Vance. And he is the best. I mean, he is the best communicator we have had on the national scene since Ronald Reagan. In fact, I told my wife today, I think he's better than Ronald Reagan. Because, and the reason is, if you haven't read, I don't know, Professor, if you can require this, but if you haven't read his book, and this is before he ever thought he was ever going to get into politics, if you haven't read his book, Hillbillyology, read it, because it tells you a lot about who he is, all right? And the reason I think he's so good is because he came from such humble beginnings that he can relate. I use that word empathy. J.D. Vance has more empathy for regular folks than anybody I've seen, with the possible exception of me, I mean, in politics. And because I think that's so important. But then secondly, I mean, it helps to have an IQ, you know, 40 points higher than mine. He's a very, very smart guy. But he communicates in a way that people can really understand him. And he's very respectful. If you watch him answer questions from the national media, he will always be respectful toward them. Now, he may joke a little bit, and he may throw in a little barb, but, and he'll do a marvelous job of saying, you know, that's a good question, but before I answer that question, I want to just say this. And then he'll come back and he'll answer the question. I cannot say, and many of my friends said when he was picked, say, oh my gosh, this guy's only been in the Senate 2 years. Why is he picking this guy we've never heard of? I said, you haven't read his book. I think he's a great pick. And we've got a lot of great communicators out there. And on both sides, really. I mean, I'm not trying to be overly partisan, but you ask a question, I gave you a straight answer. You got smart kids here, you know it? Yeah, well, I'm involved with a little company that's involved with AI, okay? And you are right. It's getting better. AI is like so many other scientific advancements. It's a double-edged sword. I mean, there are a lot of great things that are going to come out of artificial intelligence or machine learning. But there's also some things that we're going to have to figure out a way to monitor, and I don't have the answers. I'm not sure Elon Musk has the answers. I'm not sure there are enough smart people that have the answers of how we're going to do that. But it is a looming threat. But it's also a threat, and Elon has warned about this. It is what you call a disruptive technology. And it is going to disrupt a lot of things. Part of the reason that the longshoremen were on strike and will probably go back on strike after the election is because now, with these advanced computer systems, they don't need people running the cranes. They don't need people moving the material. It can all be done by computerized systems, okay? I don't think that's a good thing. I think we need people. I think, you know, we've seen where machines, no matter how smart we think they are, I mean, even Tesla has had cars that have driven into the wall, okay? And they think they can have self-driving cars. I don't think so. I don't want self-driving cars. I don't want self-driving planes. I don't, you know, in fact, I remember, believe it or not, the House Ag Committee has oversight of the Commodities, Futures and Exchange Commodities Exchange in Chicago, Chicago Board of Trade. And the Chicago Board of Trade, when I was there, came in, and they basically wanted to go all computer. And I said, you know, we've seen this before where the computers start selling, and they don't know what to do. Then the computer just keeps selling, selling, selling. And the market can just collapse in a matter of minutes. The one thing about having human traders involved, they can see this, okay, and they can stop it. The computer can't stop. It doesn't know what to do. And so I think in all kinds of fields, artificial intelligence is going to be very helpful. I will just tell you, the one place artificial intelligence I think is going to be incredibly helpful, and Mary, I'm sorry, I'm going to give a little sales pitch here. You know, she's looking at me, don't do that, is in the field of healthcare. I think you're going to see unbelievable things happening in healthcare in the next few years, largely because we can pour through mountains of data in a matter of minutes, where it used to take us months and even years. And at the end of the day, a lot of what healthcare is really about is about information. So there are good things and the bad things, but yeah, you pointed out one of the bad things, and we're going to figure out how to do that.
All right, we're coming up on 8:30, so we'll take, let's see, how many, you had 2 questions left for you?
I see 2 hands.
All right, let's do 2.
I see 3 hands then. One here and there's one back there. We'll do those 3.
I'm not a troublemaker, so I'm just going to ask this question. It's $100,000 for an unborn fetus?
No, unborn egg of an eagle.
Okay.
If you disturb one, yeah, you can be fined up to $100,000.
I'd like to pose this question. I have to have a license to teach in a public school, okay, back in the day.
Right.
So it's best to have a diversified portfolio of lots of stuff. So when you're making a choice and you're voting on an abortion issue, and you're in Congress or your representative or senator or whatever, you should have a medical license before you even make an opinion on someone else you don't even know, and the doctor has this client in the office that may be in critical condition, and she has to have surgery, and you have a bunch of congressmen and senators doing their stuff. Well, I don't have a license, a medical license, so how can you possibly vote on that issue? And the other thing is, I'm a United States Marine, and I served in 3rd Marine Division in 1963 before Vietnam even happened. Even casualties were coming during that period of time. J.D. Vance was a United States Marine, served in Afghanistan. What was his first name before he changed it to J.D. Vance? When he went in the Marine Corps, he was another person with another, he was the same person with another name. So I don't know that history. So I have to go back and find out his other name to find out what he was like in elementary school and do this and do that. So I don't know about J.D. Vance. I know he talks a lot. He's a very good debater. He's got his stuff together. So I don't know. If you want to find out about J.D. Vance, find out what his first name is. Track that down that way. Make sense?
Yeah. Well,
I'd be curious about that one.
First of all, let me thank you for your service. I mean, thank you. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Secondly, though, in terms of you should have to have a medical license to. Most of the issues you're dealing with, though, on those kinds of issues are not necessarily. I don't even really consider them medical issues. They're moral issues. All right. 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 Well, no, I mean, listen, the hardest, when I was in Congress, when I was elected to Congress the first time, I had no idea that during my tenure, I would have to vote on two of the most powerful votes that any member of Congress can ask to vote on. One was essentially to declare war in the Middle East. Now, when I took that vote, it was hard because I knew there would be young men and young women who weren't going to come back, okay? Now, I don't have to have a degree from the military academy. I don't have to have a special degree. Ultimately, that's a judgment you have to make. And I'll just be really, really honest with you. If I had that vote to do over again, I probably would not have voted the same way. But I didn't know all that I know today. But there are lots of votes. You can't, you know, there are lots of things every decision, and this is for everybody, every decision you ever make will be based on imperfect information. But the way I made my decisions on issues is, first of all, I call it the 3 C's, okay? First, I voted my conscience. Now, I'll give you an example. When I was in the state legislature, I was militantly, and remain, I don't know if militantly is the right word, but I was strongly opposed to government-sponsored gambling. When the lottery came in, I not only argued about it, argued against it, I gave speeches against it, I wrote articles against it, and 70% of the people in my district voted for it, okay? Yeah. No, I trust me. I have to bear that, right? But I will say that resolution passed almost unanimously, okay? I wasn't alone. We didn't understand everything we understand today. That's not an excuse, but that's the only way I can deal with that today myself, all right? But that is the other powerful thing that we had to vote on were the articles of impeachment. I never thought when I ran for Congress I would be voting on articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton. And here again, I think people thought, oh boy, I'll bet he's really excited and happy to do that. No, I had a pit in my stomach. You know, these are not things that you do lightly, okay? I think there's a misunderstanding that we blithely, you know, vote on some of this stuff. No, we understand there are consequences. We understand, but you also have to understand there are consequences for not doing something. So, you know, it's not as if there's never a perfect choice, and we never have perfect information.
So I guess I have 2 questions. The first one's a quick answer. When the judicial branch passed Roe v. Wade, did that turn it into a federal law?
In effect, it did, yes.
Okay, so then you talked about things that the federal government should not always be involved in,
Right.
like how they got involved with education. Do you think the abortion side of things is something the federal government should have never been involved in?
Yes, I do. And I believe that the Supreme Court ruling, if you read it, it is, and if you believe in federalism, it is crystal clear. This issue ought to be sent back to the state legislatures. States like Minnesota are going to have the most liberal abortion laws in the world, okay? States like Alabama are going to have much more restrictive. But that's up to the state legislatures and the people who elect them, okay? It is not up to 9 justices who serve for life. That was an area where the Supreme Court should not have gotten involved in, and they, in my opinion, recovered their fumble.
All right, we're going to take one more. Gil's going to stay around, and you can certainly stick around as well and ask him more questions afterwards. That'd be great.
All right, so the last question that I've got is...
Well, this is the last question, period.
Wow. Okay, what I mean is the last question of the day is basically, what are your thoughts with the debates and why we can't just have a semi-normal debate like the Vance-Walz debate was probably the most normal debate we've had because like for example the Kamala Trump debate, Trump making some out of left field claims, or the Biden Trump debate this year just devolving into who's better at golf. It's like there's no time where there's a debate where the candidates are civil and just acting like normal adults about questions.
I can answer that. What you're really talking about is civility, okay? The thing about, and I would credit both sides in the vice presidential debate. I would tend to give J.D. Vance a little more credit of being civil. There were a number of things he could have gone after our governor that he didn't, and without getting into them. But the point is, what you're really saying is what the public really wants, and they're not getting for the most part, is civility. Now, Professor Wenzel, do you have them study William Wilberforce? Okay. I would hope you might want to write a term paper about William Wilberforce. And you may have seen the movie where he fights to end the slave trade in Great Britain. He was the first politician to stand up in the House of Commons and say, slavery is evil, it is immoral, and the slave trade needs to stop. And when he finished that first speech, the other members of the House of Commons from both parties literally laughed him off the floor. But he didn't give up. He stayed at it. He stayed at it for over 40 years. And many people remember William Wilberforce because of what he did to end the slave trade in Great Britain. But the thing they don't remember about William Wilberforce was the other thing he fought for as a member of the House of Commons was civility and decency. And he wanted to bring back people. And in fact, he referred to it as manners. That the British people and their representatives in Commons had become rude and crude, and he didn't like it. And so he wanted to return manners to the House of Commons and manners to the English people. The young man who put on my microphone, he's from Great Britain, I would have to say, if you don't even have to travel, if you watch television today, thanks largely to William Wilberforce, the British people are probably among the most mannerly people you will ever meet, okay? And it all is because of one politician by the name of William Wilberforce. And we need another William Wilberforce in the United States because civility has sort of gone out and maybe it's J.D. Vance. Maybe he's the William Wilberforce of the day who can return civility not only to debates, not only to the national political stage, but more importantly, to the national media. I mean, so much of what they do, the questions they ask are like gotcha questions. And they're not necessarily questions that Americans want answered. I mean, it's sort of a game that they play, and it's not a good game, and it's not helpful to the American people. This has been a good exchange, and I want to thank you, and I want to congratulate your professor here, because I think the questions we've had tonight, I tell you, like I say, I've been on 26 college campuses. I've answered questions on every issue you can imagine. I have to say the questions tonight, if they weren't the best, they certainly were in the top 5, and I want to thank you for that. So thank you so much. I'll stick around and we'll answer some more questions. And